Hey, Push Students, Mr. Narimonte here, coming in with your sixth activity about the Republican presidents of the 1920s. So, during the Roaring Twenties, we spoke in our last video that we kind of talked about the Roaring Twenties, and we talked about the reason why it was called the Roaring Twenties was kind of outgrowth of culture, but also this kind of increase in wealth. And that wealth is happening during these Republican presidents, which kind of have a hallmark of the Republican Party that still is today, which is a kind of hands-off approach. When it comes to business, don't get involved. Don't really tax them. Don't regulate them regarding labor. Kind of just let them kind of continue going on and unharnessed, so to speak, and they'll just become stronger and stronger, and therefore produce more and more jobs and produce more and more wealth. Is the theory. Some critics would say that sometimes sometimes businesses can be corrupted. Sometimes they don't act in the fair interest of their workers or their employer or the ones that they employ. So you have to fight for wages or health care or other benefits. But the Republican Party, starting with Abraham Lincoln, but really solidifying itself right now, and also as it is now today, is really a hands-off approach towards business, really trying to support business, actually, maybe even like I said, during the Guild Age, maybe a little bit more underhanded by like cutting taxes and giving them what we consider grants or subsidies, which are actually tax cuts at certain levels. So, anyways, that's kind of what's happening during this time. It's a really I'm talking about a couple of foreign issues that are happening, but mainly a focus on the domestic economics that are happening inside the United States during the 1920s by the president. So we're gonna go through three of them. We're going to have Harding, Coolidge, and lastly Hoover. Of the three, the most important would be Herbert Hoover. He is kind of the president that is in charge when the stock market crashes, and it thrusts us into the Great Depression. And he does, he kind of in history gets a unfair treatment. He is kind of known as somebody that kind of didn't do anything while this was happening, but there are multiple efforts that he's making, and these same efforts are actually being taken up by FDR, who's kind of credited for getting us out of the Great Depression, which we'll talk about in our next video. So, with that being said, let's get into it. So, the first president of these 1920s is the 29th one. He's from 1921 to 23. His name is Harding. It says right here until his death. Actually, his vice president, Coolidge, is going to actually become president in this last year due to his early death. One thing is that you're going to see this multiple times, and kind of already talked about, is this idea called laissez-faire, which was kind of coined by Adam Smith. He kind of talked about this thing called the invisible hand, which was price, right? Price kind of went up and down according to two factors: supply and demand, right? So if there wasn't a lot of supply of something, but it's really wanted, the price would go up. You can see this in jewelry and diamonds, things that are super expensive. Usually, it's not a lot of. Well, things that you can easily find at the grocery store are much cheaper, right? So kind of that's the idea of supply and demand that would move this invisible hand, the invisible hand of the market. Well, Adam Smith and where he gets his information, the physiocrats came up with this idea called laissez-faire, which actually says government hands should be almost completely off, letting government kind of do its thing, whether it be grow or whether it fail, right? Definitely the physiocrats and laissez-faire would be horrified of what we saw now in 2008 and be really horrified of what we've seen during 2020, saying that the government's way too involved in economic affairs and way too supportive of businesses at certain levels. Just let them go. Don't hamper them, but sure as heck don't help them at the same time. They need to be able to compete and be able to compete, create better products or create better services, or in this case, I would say, cut off and get rid, kind of trim their businesses to be more efficient, which usually means the firing and laying off of workers. So it's kind of the laissez-faire idea is a really harsh kind of view, in my opinion, of economics in the world, in which people are kind of guided by kind of selfish and more business efficient and profit driven interests rather than maybe what's so best. So, in this question, in here, I saw, there's all these different pictures up here, but I saw this one. I thought this was kind of an interesting one. There's this guy, he's pointing at, he's like, mass unemployment, he's freaking out. And there's the government just kind of chilling out. There's cobwebs everywhere. Don't do anything. Don't touch anything. Don't bail out businesses, don't bail out banks, don't send out stimulus checks, don't increase taxes, don't decrease taxes, just don't do anything, hands off. Um, I would say that this economic policy largely has never really actually been implemented at certain levels. Government has always been involved in the economic affairs of its own country, obviously. It's one of the most important things it can do for its people in historical times is having a strong economy. So in that way, politicians and the government are going to get involved to help either support it and make it stronger or, fix it at certain levels, the Republicans scream with this to say government doesn't know how to fix business. Business is the only thing that needs to fix business. So that's that kind of fight that we actually still see today. Um, but laissez-faire, it's interesting. It's almost like freedom. I feel like there's degrees of it, right? It's not a very clear definition. But the Republicans are more on the side of hands off. Don't do anything. But we're going to see, like I said earlier, Hoover actually do things and get involved and almost act like a Democrat that FDR was, who got super involved and almost kind of some people would criticize him as almost turning it into this a socialist or communist state, that the government was having so much control of its economic affairs over the United States because of the Great Depression and the effects of what was happening in the Great Depression. Um, One thing, that we see that's abundantly clear with these reparations, and we talk about World War One, is we definitely have like a globalized economy, right? And it's really between these two areas, right? Europe and the United States, because Europe, through its colonies, are accessing other areas. But the strong economic tie between the two and the trading of goods is super important. And we know in World War One, it was largely devastated, and this area, whether it be food or clothing or ships or later just money, they're going to depend on the United States. And this game of giving money and giving goods has been going on, but it kind of got disrupted in World War One and kind of gave the United States an unfair advantage, where the United States kind of having the monopoly of goods, the things that were coming over there. When you're at war, you're not probably worried too much more about the farmings, right? You have to kind of depend on others. So with that being said, that the warfare that happened inside of Europe, specifically France and Germany, really devastates this area. But after that, they kind of start rebuilding and their economy starts going, and goods are starting to come back, which are competing with the United States. And those are kind of driving down the prices of United States goods. So we've seen this before. We've seen this mercantilist reaction. We've seen it currently with our current president, Trump at the time, where he put on these taxes, right? He put them on China. In this case, a protective tax. We saw this in the 1800s under Jefferson, is put on so that when goods cross over here, the tax is applied, making these goods more expensive in the United States. The idea is to encourage more consumption. That means the buying and purchasing of goods inside the United States rather than doing foreign ones, right? To spur the economy of the United States. The Gilded Age kind of shows this kind of relationship between business and government that I think is still very strong today and can be exemplified in multiple things, between banks and oil companies and other things. In this case, the teapot dome scandal was in which a an oil company was basically given immediate rights to land and didn't have to bid it, and it was kind of bought off with bribes by the oil company to a representative inside of Harding's government. So these things are happening. You're going to read a little bit more, but definitely, these type of corruptive influences are happening still inside the government. As I stated earlier, Harding is going to pass, and Coolidge will come to power, or will come from vice president to president. One thing I want to talk about here is just kind of talk about these words a little bit more. I did my best to define them because they just kind of talk about it inside the article, but I wanted to show you that, when we talk about fiscal conservatism, which typically the Republican Party has stood for, it's the idea to bring down government spending, to limit it. And then while you're limiting it, since you don't need to have as much spending, you can therefore cut taxes. So that's kind of what the really the heart of the economic policy of the Republican Party is. The Democrats currently has said this, yeah, I mean, we definitely would like to cut taxes, but in some cases we need to increase taxes, especially those on the wealthy, to pay for services for the poor. So those are the kind of two issues that are kind of happening at this time. So at this time, the Republicans back then, and theoretically as they stand today, is really about trying to limit the amount of debt that the government has or how much spending it has. So there's that. He also known as a social progressive, and he's kind of focused on poor, on women, on workers, these kind of marginalized groups as the governor of Massachusetts. That kind of shows this progressive side, and I think that's what's interesting. I think there's a lot of individuals that identify themselves today as socially progressivism. Like really looking at minority groups and women and feminist outcries. So those are kind of the things are balancing Calvin Coolidge, and that's what he's kind of known for. And you're kind of seeing a little bit of a difference of a focus by the Republican Party to not just be on the focus on the upper class and the rich, but also those that are marginalized as well. They create something called the Kellogg Beyond Pact during his presidency, and it's kind of laughed upon in history. It was this statement saying that they would never use war. The United States would never use war as an instrument to stop fights. That they would try to use diplomacy and neutrality and conversations. Obviously, this is going to happen because of the World War II. But it just shows during this time that the United States is still trying to establish its neutrality and trying to stay away from these European affairs and these world affairs that they think may be coming in. You notice the time period from to 1936. It's at some levels, that at this time there's some massive turmoil that's happening inside of Europe. The last president is Herbert Hoover. Kind of is known for two things: the Hoover Dam, which was built as a project by the government to employ people who were unemployed, and this again is an example of something that FDR would do as well. But he's kind of also known for something called Hoovervilles, and as I stated earlier, he is the president that is in office when the Great Depression begins, and these Hoovervilles, as you can see here, are basically shacks. People were kicked out of their homes of the cities. They had lost their jobs, and out in parks outside of the city, these shacks would show up. These aren't homes. There's no running water. These are getting pallets, getting pieces of wood, getting scrap wood, and putting these things together and living them. So just above like a tent and camping. So this is kind of what he was kind of known for. You'll read and they'll talk about all the examples of things that he did do and things that the Democrats underneath or Franklin Delano Roosevelt will do under his presidency to try to spur the economy as well. So he's giving an unfair look in history, but we're here to dispel those myths as AP US history students, and so we'll kind of talk about more. All right, guys. We'll go ahead and talk about in the next one. We'll talk about the response to the Great Depression that has happened underneath Hoover by FDR and his New Deal. All right, take care now.